Listen, I want you to picture something for a second. Picture a global empire, an absolute, unquestioned juggernaut of an empire that literally rewired the way human beings communicate with one another. I'm talking about a company that built a product so deeply embedded in our culture, so incredibly essential to daily life, that getting one on your first day of a corporate job was like receiving a Medal of Honor. A device that was physically in the pocket of every single major world leader, every high-powered Wall Street executive making million-dollar trades, and every A-list celebrity walking down the red carpet. They had a total, suffocating monopoly. They held the entire world right in the palm of their hands. And then, almost overnight, they lost every single bit of it. I mean, they didn't just lose a little market share or have a couple of bad quarters, they evaporated. They went from completely ruling the earth to desperately fighting for the absolute bottom of the barrel scraps. Eventually, they became the ultimate cautionary tale of corporate blindness. Today, in this explainer, we're going to meticulously break down the anatomy of a complete, catastrophic corporate collapse. We are going to see exactly what happens when the board of a multi-billion-dollar tech giant looks the future dead in the eye and just willfully decides to ignore it. All right, let's get into this.
So this is really the ultimate question of our story today. What actually happens when the most powerful, resource-rich tech empire on the planet goes completely voluntarily blind? Think about the sheer scale here. You have billions and billions of dollars sitting in the bank. You employ literally the smartest engineers in the world. You have an ironclad grip on carrier relationships that your competitors would kill for. You have the ultimate, undisputed global distribution network. So how on earth do you wake up one random morning and realize the entire industry has just left you behind, left you in the dust? Look, this isn't just a basic business case study about a faulty product. This is a story about sheer, unadulterated hubris. It's a deep dive into human nature and corporate psychology. It's the story of a group of unbelievably brilliant people who built an impenetrable fortress, decided to lock the doors from the inside, and completely, totally missed the massive, flaming meteor that was heading straight for their roof. To really grasp the magnitude of this, we have to set the stage. Let's travel back to the mid-2000s. We need to understand the absolute sheer gravity of this company's dominance. This was an era completely and totally ruled by one specific, entirely irresistible little device. If you were anybody, and I mean anybody, you had one. The President of the United States famously fought the Secret Service because he refused to give his up. Kim Kardashian was constantly photographed with one. Wall Street bankers were essentially glued to these things 24/7. It was the absolute ultimate status symbol of the decade. But here's the thing, it wasn't just a phone. Far from it. It was a literal lifeline. For the very first time in human history, you could essentially carry your entire professional life right there in your front pocket. You could read lengthy contracts on a commuter train. You could text a coworker with military-grade encryption from a coffee shop in Paris. It completely and permanently blurred the lines between your work life and your personal life. And that world-dominating device, of course, was the BlackBerry. Their cultural impact was so incredibly profound, it honestly became a behavioral addiction. The term crackberry wasn't just a cute joke. It was a cultural phenomenon. It was a slang term, perfectly blending crack cocaine and BlackBerry, and it described this brand new, genuinely overwhelming human urge to just constantly look down, to check your secure emails, to check your BlackBerry Messenger or BBM. I mean, you'd be at a nice dinner with your family, you'd feel that little phantom vibration in your pocket, and you just had to look. You couldn't stop yourself. And the physical keyboard. People were so obsessed with those tactile, clicky little keys typing away at absolute lightning speeds under the dinner table without even looking at the screen. BlackBerry didn't just manufacture a mobile phone. They engineered a psychological habit. And let me tell you, that behavioral addiction translated into market dominance that is almost hard to comprehend today. By 2009, BlackBerry controlled a staggering 50% of the United States handset market. 50%. Half of all smartphones sold in the entire country were BlackBerries. They were virtually invincible. They had the massive telecom carriers, your AT&Ts and your Verizons completely wrapped around their little fingers. Why? Because the carriers absolutely loved that BlackBerry devices sipped data. They used almost nothing. They were incredibly efficient. They were locked down secure. If you wanted to run a serious business, you literally had no choice but to buy and install expensive BlackBerry servers in your IT department. It was this perfect, completely closed loop of endless profit. They were standing on top of the world, looking down at everyone else. But you know, while they were so busy looking down at their beautiful little physical keyboards, someone else out there was looking up. Which brings us to part one of our explainer, the blind spot, ignoring the iPhone. In every great historical tragedy, there is always that one specific moment where the ground shifts. The tectonic plates of the industry suddenly violently grind together, and you either move with them or you get totally crushed.
For BlackBerry, that exact moment arrived in January 2007. Steve Jobs walked out onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the original Apple iPhone. It was this stunning, minimalist piece of glass. No physical keyboard whatsoever. It boasted a full desktop-class web browser. It was a radically, completely different vision for what a mobile phone could actually be. Jobs wasn't pitching a strict business tool. He was pitching a pocket-sized personal computer for the everyday consumer. Now, logically, you would think that BlackBerry's leadership would immediately go to red alert, right? You'd think they'd hit the panic button, call an emergency board meeting at 3 a.m., and figure out a battle plan. But they didn't. They didn't do any of that. This quote right here just brilliantly illustrates their entire mindset. Jim Balsillie, the co-CEO of BlackBerry, actually watched the iPhone announcement, and his official reaction? Apple's got a better deal than us. The US market is going to be tougher. It's okay. We'll be fine. It's okay. We'll be fine. They literally wrote it off. They looked at the iPhone and completely dismissed it as a fragile little toy. To them, it didn't target their highly lucrative core business users, it lacked military-grade secure corporate email, and worst of all in their eyes, it had a digital on-screen keyboard, which BlackBerry executives honestly believed was an absolute joke. They were convinced that no serious professional on Earth would ever try to type out a business memo on a flat, lifeless piece of glass.
You really have to understand the fundamental clash of philosophies here. It's critical. BlackBerry was an empire built on 4 incredibly strict pillars. Unbelievable battery life that could easily last you days without a charge, a practically perfect physical typing experience, uncrackable security, and extremely low network bandwidth use. They compress data like absolute magicians. Then you look over at Apple's new paradigm. The first iPhone had a battery that, if you were lucky, barely scraped through a single day. It obviously had 0 physical keys, and it was a massive network hog. It aggressively pulled down massive amounts of data just to load up full, heavy desktop websites over a mobile connection. By every single one of BlackBerry's strict internal engineering metrics, the iPhone was a fundamentally terrible, deeply flawed product. It broke every rule in their playbook. They fully believed consumers would absolutely despise having to plug their phones into a wall every single night, and they were dead certain that the telecom carriers would eventually block Apple entirely for completely crushing their cell towers with all that heavy web traffic.
In fact, this internal denial went so unbelievably deep, it heavily infected the entire engineering department. When BlackBerry, which, by the way, was formerly known as Research in Motion, or RIM back then, when their top-tier engineers actually sat down and watched Steve Jobs seamlessly use the iPhone on stage, they were in a state of total, utter disbelief. They were shocked. And I don't mean they were impressed. I mean they literally thought Apple was faking the entire presentation. They firmly believed that a mobile device simply could not do what Steve Jobs was demonstrating up there, scrolling buttery smooth, fruitful web pages, pinching to zoom on photos, without housing a massive, incredibly power-hungry processor that would literally melt the battery in under an hour. They genuinely thought it was a staged parlor trick. So, just imagine their utter shock when they finally managed to get their hands on a real iPhone, cracked the thing open in their labs, and realized it wasn't a trick at all. It was completely real. Apple had basically just strapped a tiny, highly efficient computer logic board to a comparatively giant battery. The entire game had completely changed, and BlackBerry hadn't even realized the opening whistle had blown. The iPhone rapidly morphed into a massive, unstoppable cultural phenomenon, and then the exact thing BlackBerry thought was impossible happened. Hardcore business executives started strolling into the office carrying an iPhone. The strict, impenetrable corporate firewall started to crack, and suddenly, BlackBerry woke up. Let's move to part 2, the panic. The storm disaster. Now, time was moving incredibly, brutally fast. The industry was advancing at warp speed. In January 2007, the first iPhone launches. Fast forward just a bit to July 2008, and Apple is already rolling out the iPhone 3G and, infinitely more importantly, the App Store. The App Store changed literally everything about what a phone was supposed to do. Meanwhile, over at BlackBerry headquarters, the vibe had shifted from arrogant denial to absolute sheer panic mode. Verizon Wireless, the massive cellular carrier, came marching into BlackBerry furious. See, AT&T had secured the exclusive rights to sell the iPhone, and Verizon was bleeding highly profitable customers by the thousands. Verizon looked at BlackBerry and basically said, "You need to build us an iPhone killer, and you need to do it right now." So deeply panicked, BlackBerry rushed into development to build their very first ever touchscreen phone. They called it the BlackBerry Storm. But because they were terrified, panicked, and rushing the engineering process, it finally released in late 2008, a full 6 months past its deadline. And guys, it was an absolute unmitigated mess. The Storm was the perfect, tragic result of a company desperately trying to be something it fundamentally wasn't. Step 1. Because the executives at BlackBerry absolutely could not let go of the idea of a physical keyboard, they engineered this bizarre clickable glass screen. I'm totally serious.
The entire massive glass panel literally physically clicked downward into the chassis when you pushed on it with your thumb, trying to mimic the physical feedback of a real button. It was weird, it felt incredibly clunky, and mechanically, it broke constantly. Step 2. The rush job meant the software was catastrophically buggy. The web browser was just painfully, agonizingly slow, especially when you compared it to Apple's lightning-fast mobile Safari. Step 3. It crashed all the time. It was so bad that internally, BlackBerry's own employees were deeply embarrassed by the product. They actually started referring to the device around the office as a shitstorm. But here is the truly crazy part of this whole chapter. The phone actually sold over 1 million units right out of the gate at launch. Why? Because regular people still deeply trusted the BlackBerry brand name. But trust me, that legacy of trust was about to be completely shattered. Because it turned out almost every single one of those initial storm devices was hopelessly faulty. People absolutely despised them. Customers were dragging them back to the Verizon stores and returning them in massive, unprecedented droves. And Verizon was, understandably, absolutely furious. They marched right back to BlackBerry and demanded an unbelievable, jaw-dropping sum of money to make it right. $500 million. Verizon wanted $500 million from BlackBerry just to cover the massive logistical and financial losses they took trying to replace nearly every single faulty storm unit they had shipped out to their customers. BlackBerry's leadership was completely stunned. I mean, they were a wealthy company, but they did not just have $500 million in liquid cash to casually hand over as an apology. They had to grovel, they had to beg, offer millions in free repairs, and make massive, humiliating concessions just to desperately keep Verizon as a distribution partner. It was incredibly demoralizing for the entire workforce. It completely shattered the long-held industry illusion of BlackBerry's flawless, bulletproof engineering. For the first time ever, the armor was visibly cracked.
And that brings us to part 3, the desperate final gamble, BlackBerry 10. So after the utter humiliation of the storm disaster, BlackBerry spent the next few critical years just totally lost in the wilderness. They were completely directionless. They tried a bunch of weird half measures. They released phones that awkwardly mashed together tiny touchscreens with cramped physical keyboards, hoping to please everyone but ultimately pleasing no one. Meanwhile, Apple and a massive new aggressive rival, Google's Android operating system, were rapidly carving up the entire globe. Screens were getting bigger and sharper, apps were becoming everything. BlackBerry was just slowly, painfully bleeding out market share. Eventually, the board of directors finally woke up and realized they needed a massive, total reboot, a hard reset. They fired the legendary founding CEOs, they brought in a new guy to steer the ship, Thorsten Heinz, and they made the massive decision to scrap absolutely all of their old legacy software to build a brand new, highly advanced touch and gesture-based operating system totally from scratch. They went out and acquired a highly respected software company called QNX to build a super stable, industrial-grade foundation for it. They dubbed it BlackBerry 10, and man, they pushed all their remaining chips into the center of the table. They hosted massive, flashy developer conferences. They literally threw millions of dollars in incentives at app developers to try and make this ecosystem work. This whole project was meant to be the absolute savior of the company, the ultimate product that would finally, once and for all, allow them to fight back against the iOS and Android duopoly. But there was one single fatal problem with this massive gamble. It arrived far, far, far too late. See, BlackBerry 10 finally made its grand debut in January of 2013. I really want you to stop and think about that timeline for a second. The original iPhone launched in early 2007. It literally took BlackBerry 6 whole years to put out a true, fully modern, from the ground up competitor. By 2013, the smartphone war was already completely over. The ecosystem was literally everything. A modern smartphone is honestly just a useless slab of plastic and glass if it doesn't have a thriving, vibrant app store behind it. So BB10 launches, and the app store is practically a ghost town. It completely lacked the major cultural apps. No Spotify to stream your music, no Tumblr, no Instagram. They tried to put a band-aid on it with this clever little technical trick, allowing the new phones to awkwardly emulate Android apps, but the experience was incredibly sluggish, buggy, and just weird to use. The whole phone felt totally disconnected from the wider digital world. And honestly, even worse than all of that, their absolute crown jewel, BlackBerry Messenger, had completely lost its magic. Everyone had already packed up and moved over to modern cross-platform apps like WhatsApp and iMessage. BBM was rapidly dying out. And the truly tragic part is that the actual BB10 physical phones, like the Z10, were genuinely beautifully designed pieces of hardware. They felt great, but nobody cared anymore. The party had completely moved on without them. Now for the final act. Part 4, the empire collapses. Look, when you push absolutely all of your chips to the very center of the table on a massive gamble and you lose the hand,
there is really nothing left to do but pack up your things and go home. The harsh, unforgiving financial realities of the modern tech market hit BlackBerry like an absolute freight train. The sheer speed of their descent into total irrelevance was breathtaking to watch. Look at this. In 2009, as we talked about, they held that godlike 50% monopoly over the US market. By 2013, just 4 incredibly short years later, their market share was sitting at under 3%. It is almost completely unheard of in modern corporate history to watch a massive, globally recognized, dominant brand lose practically its entire global customer base that rapidly. Everyday consumers had completely abandoned them. And even the most strict, loyal, old-school corporate IT managers, the men and women who had passionately defended BlackBerry servers for years, finally just threw their hands up and gave in. They implemented bring-your-own-device policies, letting employees seamlessly connect their personal iPhones and shiny new Androids to the corporate network. The impenetrable fortress had totally, completely crumbled to dust. And the resulting financial damage was nothing short of catastrophic, because literally nobody was buying these shiny new BlackBerry 10 devices they had bet the farm on. The company was suddenly left sitting on giant warehouses, absolutely stuffed to the ceiling with expensive, completely unsold plastic, metal, and glass. In late 2013, they had to take a staggering, humiliating inventory write-off, $934 million. Let that sink in. Nearly $1 billion in pristine, boxed up, completely unsold Z10 handsets basically had to be thrown directly into the financial trash can. It was a fatal, crushing blow. The entire company panicked and desperately tried to put a for sale sign on the front lawn. A massive shareholder, Fairfax Financial, actually tried to put together a $4.7 billion rescue package to take the deeply wounded company private and try to fix it behind closed doors. But even that massive deal ultimately collapsed. In the end, nobody on Wall Street wanted to risk catching a falling life. The rescue bid failed, the CEO, Thorsten Heinz, was abruptly fired, and the once mighty tech giant was left completely and utterly adrift in the ocean. The raw financial numbers truly tell the core story of this corporate tragedy better than anything else. Back in 2008, right at the absolute dizzying height of the whole crackberry cultural craze, this was a $55 billion titan of industry. But by 2013, that massive valuation had plummeted violently to just $6 billion. Tens of billions of dollars in tangible wealth completely and totally evaporated into thin air because a few executives couldn't see past their own keyboards. Eventually, they formally stopped manufacturing mobile phones entirely, pivoting hard to become a quiet, behind-the-scenes enterprise software and cybersecurity company, basically just licensing out their famous logo to third-party manufacturers. The iconic, clicky physical devices that quite literally defined an entire generation of communication became nothing more than dusty relics, totally left behind in a museum of failed corporate strategy. We're going to wrap this up with a truly profound, incredibly candid realization from Mike Lazaridis, the brilliant engineering mind and co-founder of BlackBerry. Years after the total collapse, looking back with 2020 hindsight at exactly where the whole thing went so horribly wrong, he said this about the iPhone. It allowed Apple to reset what the expectations were. Conservation didn't matter, battery life didn't matter, cost didn't matter. That's their genius. You see, BlackBerry actually played their specific game flawlessly. They totally mastered multi-day battery life, they absolutely mastered the physical keyboard, they mastered incredible data efficiency, but they completely failed to realize that Apple hadn't just entered their game. Apple had completely fundamentally rewritten the rules of the entire sport. And when you stubbornly refuse to play by the new rules, you don't just lose a few points, you get entirely wiped off the board. So as we wrap up this explainer, it really leaves you with a lingering thought. When you look around at your own life or at the massive corporate giants dominating the news today, who do you think is currently sitting in a boardroom, laughing at the future? What invincible giant is about to go entirely blind? Thanks for hanging out with me on this explainer. Keep learning, keep questioning, and whatever you do, always keep your eyes wide open.